Hello, hello, and welcome back to another lovely live stream on Legalbytes. If you are new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer and I'm licensed in California and DC. I don't know why I'm a little bit blurry right now. For some reason, the background, it's like the camera just wants Indy. The camera doesn't want me right now. The camera wants to see Indy. Hopefully we can. Oh wait, let's try this. Maybe this will work. If I slowly do, maybe that's better. I think that, okay, I think that's better. Anyway, I'm just kind of talking to myself now, but I have a wonderful guest today. Her name is Gabriella Hoffman, or Gabby Hoffman. She is actually a friend of mine, oddly enough, since childhood. Fun story. But I'm going to go ahead and bring her on. So, Gabby, how are you?
I'm well. I really love retelling this story. And for your viewers, I think they'll find it hilarious that we actually grew up in the same county in California. We both are from South Orange County.
Yep.
We met for the first time in 1999 at SFO Airport when both of our families were on our way to Lithuania, where we have a lot of immediate roots to. I am a little closer by one generation to you. You're second generation American, or one and a half generation. I'm first generation American.
Yeah.
And we had a crazy flight on Finnish Air and it imperiled us and kept us stuck there for like 15 hours. So we always look fondly in my family on that trip, and I tried to avoid SFO. And we actually lost touch for quite a while. Your brother had reconnected with me like 5 or 6 years ago, and I was like, Majeka. I was like, oh my gosh, it's Conrad and the Majeka siblings. So it was great to reconnect then. And we reconnected in person a few years ago when you moved out this way. And we've been in touch ever since. We went to actually the same university, didn't know that either until we reconnected, although you were a few years ahead of me at UCSD. So a lot of overlap. And I'm so grateful to share with your viewers about this really interesting topic about labor law, freelancing, independent contracting work, and so much more. I know a lot of people watching may have thoughts about it. They may be contemplating it. Maybe they are independent contractors themselves. And I think this issue is going to start to have more exposure, especially in 2022. We see a lot of push for labor, whether it's in the form of unionization, allowing contractors to or workers to collectively bargain, things of that sort. So much to discuss. And I'm happy to break down what's trending with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially for purposes of like YouTube, social media, you've got a lot of people that are content creators, influencers that are on in this space that are I mean, they usually have some sort of a very small business themselves, and a lot of times people are hiring out editors, they're hiring out people to make thumbnails for videos, they're hiring out people to do all kinds of little piecemeal things that are part of their whole sort of their whole set of tasks that they have to do in order to run the business that they're running, however big or small it is. You know, whether you're Phil DeFranco and you're running this whole, like, you've got a bunch of people that are like actually, you know, actively regularly working under you, or you're someone a little bit smaller and you're just kind of like, you know, asking for a little bit of help here and there. This is the kind of stuff that could potentially come into play and may have an impact on all of these people, because we're talking about hiring people out as independent contractors in a lot of these situations, unless you're much bigger, like a Phil DeFranco or, you know, Think Media, some of these other like big channels where people are, you know, where they actually have hired employees because they have, you know, regular income that's been generated, you know, that kind of stuff. So I think that there is a lot of interest for content creators as well as for, you know, everyday people that are, let's say you're running an Etsy shop, or let's say you've got, you know, some other kind of a side gig. A lot of people have a lot of things that a lot of ways that they're trying to, you know, maximize their income, maximize their you know, overall prospects for their financial future. And so this is one of those ways that these laws can have a really big impact.
And it's really puzzling to me that the very act of people engaging in the so-called freelance economy, or rather the gig economy as it's being billed, I like to lean on more so the freelance economy, not because gig work is a horrible term. It doesn't accurately portray gig workers. You are working multiple gigs. I myself am a freelancer who has multiple gigs, but I work on a full-time basis. I think people think that you're not working a full-time basis even though you have a higher Rolodex or a bigger Rolodex of clients. But what's puzzling to me is people call this form of work, when you choose to work flexibly, exploitation. Certainly there are instances of misclassification. I have no doubt there is. And if they are, they have to be rectified and fixed. But to take a minor issue in the big scheme of things and blanket statement, like apply it to every single worker, independent worker especially, or flexible worker, that's going to create a lot of problems. And as you know, in California, we've seen the firsthand effects of what a law like that can do as it relates to how workers are classified. And now workers have to prove they're not employees in California through an ABC test. And I know you'll explain the case that's sprung this about.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's, before we get into the individual that we're going to be focusing on, and some of the kinds of laws that he's talked about, and some of the policy changes that he's advocated for in the past, which we can probably expect him to advocate for in the future. Let's talk a little bit about your background. So what do you do on a regular basis? Where can people find you? That kind of stuff.
Perhaps unlike most of your guests on the program, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't profess to be a lawyer. So I'm going to put that out there. But I try to follow laws and dissect laws in my profession as a full-time freelancer. So as a freelance journalist, as part of my one of many responsibilities and kind of tasks that I undertake. So I do a lot of writing and reporting. I've interviewed a lot of prominent people in politics, private sector, different industries, and really have tried to talk about different issues that are not being discussed, including this subject relating to independent contractors. So I love to ask lawmakers, politicians, any prominent people what their thoughts are on the future of work in this country. And I think it's an important discussion to have. And for me, I tackle, I work in politics. I also work a lot in the outdoor industry. I'm an award-winning outdoor writer. I cover original reporting on topics that people don't like to discuss or have a very kind of biased view towards. So I try to dissect a lot of complex issues in layman's terms so people can understand what's going on and how laws or existing laws in this country as it relates to wildlife conservation, energy use, things of that sort are there to promote conservation. And if we steep away from that to promote like preservation, which are two very different things, it could create a lot of complications. I also focus on working with even smaller kind of private clients. I've worked with fly fishing lodges. I've worked with startup companies. I worked with a tech company to help with cybersecurity issues. I've worked on political campaigns. I've done public type of sector speaking opportunities in different state legislatures. I worked in Pennsylvania a few years ago to train them about best practices in social media. So I've done the whole gamut, what you could think of a freelancer does, and I do this on a full-time basis. In my journey as a freelancer, it wasn't like rags to riches immediately. You don't get rich immediately if you're a freelancer. That's something people have to be aware of. It takes a lot of time. And when you grind and when you dedicate a lot of time and you go through challenges, jump through hoops, and struggle a little bit on the way, you really appreciate the success you achieve later on. And so I'm going into my 6th year as a full-time freelancer, and I've seen the fruits of my labor materialize. I've started to get higher dollar clients. I really enjoy the independent contractor status I have because I can tell prospective clients and say, well, I want to work with you on a contractor basis because I would lose out on other opportunities to gain financially. And I don't want to be just tied to you guys. Love you guys, but I want to have like more clients to work with because I like to have a diversity of workflow and diversity of materials to work with. And so for me, I found that to be a really amenable kind of arrangement for me. And I know lots of other people have found that to be a really desirable arrangement for them. Certainly not everyone can succeed as a full-time freelancer. If you don't complete, let's say what they call the 3-year threshold mark successfully, it is really, really hard to pursue this full-time. And even any small business you do, whether you're a one-person business like me, or you're running a brick and mortar small business shop that you eventually want to make into a big business, they say about 3 years is the time to determine whether or not you want to take your business full-time or really go full throttle with it. And so for me, I was able to hit that 3-year mark and just keep on going. And now, despite COVID, I've been able to have steady workflow, have a lot of clients. I have to reject client work now because of my schedule and other commitments that I have.
It's a good problem to have.
Yeah, a good problem to have. And I will kind of conclude by saying this, that I also have 2 fellowships that I do on top of my existing work. and it's largely compensated fellowships, which are phenomenal. And I had to do some uncompensated fellowship work a little bit recently too, and that's fine because I love doing it. I love growing in my experience and my skill set, and I use those to supplement my business work. And I talk about this freelance issue from a labor policy standpoint in great detail through both of my fellowships with the Independent Women's Forum, which is a great outlet for women. We also have a legal center. I can't speak to the legal center, but I know it's a phenomenal shop that we have. And then with the Young Voices Contributor Program, it's for young professionals who support like liberty-minded ideas, whether they're between the ages of 18 to 35. So I still fit in that age group. Thankfully, I have a few more years. So I'm now into my second semester, you could say, of working with them as a contractor, and same with IWF. So it's great. I get to live out my freelance lifestyle and also try to defend freelancers from a public policy space as well, and really fight for them, and kind of see unusual coalitions form between Democrats, Republicans, libertarians, independents, socialists, what have you. It's actually one of the few unifying issues that brings people together in these really divided times.
And that's really interesting. And it kind, I mean, it makes sense because this is one area of law that really impacts everyone, right? Because everybody has to make, we all need money, we all need some kind of a resource to buy things so that we can live, right? So, most people have to rely upon some form of income for that. So employment law, these kinds of employment issues, independent contractor issues, these really do affect a lot of people. So I guess it makes sense that would be one of these sort of politically intersecting areas. And I'm sure you've had tons of really interesting conversations with a lot of different people to that effect.
There have been a lot of conversations. I talk to people on the left side of the spectrum who really feel voiceless. They feel like their party elders are not listening to them, and they are looking to people who are Republicans and conservatives like me for answers and for help and for pushing out their concerns. And this really should be a bipartisan issue. It's pretty concerning to me that very few elected Democrats now, with some exceptions, have said, yes, we're going to defend your right to independently contract or to be a part-time gig worker. So I think there is grassroots interest among Democrats and people on the center left who want to safeguard their livelihoods. And I talk to a lot of people who identify that way politically at the grassroots level too, who just are completely frustrated that only one party is boldly defending your right to work flexibly and to be kind of a free worker, in a sense, like a worker not tied down to a 9-to-5 job.
Right. So on that note, let's talk about some of your writing, shall we? We have this article here that you just wrote. Let me share my screen if I can, right here. Here we go. You wrote this on January 11th, just recently, because there is a nominee to the the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division Administrator, David Weil. He's a nominee. He held that position under the Biden administration, and now
Obama administration.
Yeah. Excuse me. Same, right? The Obama administration, and now the Biden administration has nominated him for that same role. And you wrote this really great article talking about kind of some of his policies under his administration, so to speak, in that role, and kind of a lot of the stuff that he's been talking about here as well. So why don't we talk about it?
Yeah, I love that you can do this, and you're going to have to explain to me how StreamYard works. I started to explore it a bit, but I love the fact that we can talk about this in real time and scroll through the article. And for me, I really fell to this issue by accident. Like I said, because I'm a freelancer, I normally don't focus on labor. I focus on natural resources, kind of other pet issues, Second Amendment, things that are a little more discussed, but this is a little more opaque for people. And when I noticed that he was being considered and no one was talking about it, I kind of thought to myself that someone needs to discuss him a bit more, and who better than a freelancer who would be impacted by his potential rulemaking that he would do should he be returning to the agency. And I was reading through some of his past remarks, some of his administrator observations. They're called AIs. They're like memos for the agency. I can't recall the exact term of it off the top of my head right now, but they're called AIs and they're memos. And he issued several of them relating to independent contractors, the joint employer rule, and I think there's a third caveat that I talked about in the article as well. And this was during his tenure between 2014 and 2017. And I think, oh, perfect, you're scrolling it. So he issued an administrator's interpretation, yes.
Yeah.
That falsely claimed that worker misclassification was a root problem in the workplace. And he concluded, as I mentioned here in the article, that the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is what he would use or what he would tweak to change how workers are classified. He believes that you should use an ABC test to determine if a worker is an independent contractor or employee. And when you use an ABC test, for those of you unfamiliar, it makes you a default employee unless you can competently prove, and you'll have to jump through hurdles and prove through somewhat difficult means if you are an independent contractor. So it makes it harder for workers to be free of traditional employee-employer arrangements. So he's written memos about his desire to look into options like an ABC test. And I've seen some writings from him saying that he would like Congress to implement a ABC test. And as you know, in California, the ABC test has been extremely disastrous. I've never seen a law go into effect so quickly and enact so much pain onto its residents like that of AB5. And actually, the chief author of AB5 just resigned from the legislature, interestingly enough, to lead one of the biggest big labor organizations in California. So it's interesting what will happen with the future of AB5 and kind of her machinations, given her what she did in her tenure. If California lawmakers move away from what she did and kind of undo the damage that AB5 caused, even with the carve-outs with Prop 22, and there was another bill too that was signed by Gavin Newsom to stop the damage, so to speak, but that didn't really stop the bleeding, as I note in my article. And so it's really interesting. He kind of wants to take California's model and export it nationwide. And that's what actually even the new labor secretary, Marty Walsh, wants to do. He hasn't really boldly come out and say it, but he has said, we would like to explore these options. You haven't really heard any affirmation for independent contractors. There's, I think, lockstep in wanting to pursue this, unless I'm reading this entirely wrong, but I haven't seen any commentary from either the chief labor guy, like I said, Marty Walsh, or this potential confirmed nominee, David Weil, to come back to his old job to give assurances to freelancers, of which there are 59 million strong and growing, or about 36% of the workforce, compared to about 10.8% that are unionized workforce participants. And so it's really interesting how they really want to appeal to this special interest group, big labor, which is very powerful. I was reading somewhere that they have like $11 billion available to them through dues, union paying dues, and other fees that are collected from unionized members. So they're not a weakened force. They're actually really powerful, even though it's not really reflected in the workforce. But they have a lot of money and a lot of sway, especially with the Biden administration. And they were responsible for electing Biden to office. And Biden has supported and given a nod to AB5 on Twitter. He's even supported the PRO Act and different statements he's made since being elected to office, inaugurated into office more accurately. He has said he wants to see Congress pass the PRO Act in some form or fashion. He's frustrated that it hasn't passed because of his focus on having and encouraging or rehabilitating union jobs, which are languishing because the market is moving away from that old framework. We're not in the 1930s anymore. It's 2022. A lot of things have changed. Workforce conditions have improved, but workers are not monolithic anymore. It's not people working in the steel factories, people working in coal mines as unionized workers. Although those professions are greatly noble, and I feel like a lot of them, especially energy workers who are unionized, don't feel like they have their interests heard, given the fact that Keystone Pipeline was canceled. A little bit unrelated to this discussion.
Yeah.
But you see a lot of push for big labor policies, and pro-labor doesn't necessarily mean pro-worker. That's something I want to convey to your audience here, because you're going to see, and you are already initially seeing, the conflation of, well, this is pro labor, therefore it's pro worker. But you hear
Mhm.
from a lot of workers like me, even beyond me, more serious workers and people who have far more clout probably than I do, and who've worked in freelancing a lot longer than I have, who've said, well, workers can't be classified or lumped into a one size fits all approach. It's not legally sound to do. You can't do it because there's no appetite to classify all workers as one and the same, because we're such a individualistic, I would say, country. All people can't be deemed the same when it comes to any other area. Like, I don't think you can regulate everyone equally in certain industries, because there are different skill sets, there's different interests, there's different experience levels. So it'd be really hard for the government to come in and say, you all are employees, when in fact I'm not an employee. I'm not working for one company full time. I'm working for 4 or 5, maybe 6 companies on a large scale basis, smaller scale basis, per
Right.
project, per diem basis. And so I shouldn't be regulated as an employee or classified as an employee because my work does not reflect that. And I think a lot of other independent workers are also conveying their frustrations with these desires, whether it's through regulatory fiat under David Weil, potentially returning to his old seat, or seeing Congress potentially weigh in on this. Actually, Congress passed the federal version of AB 5, which is known as the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, in the House of Representatives the last 2 years. It's
Which is
actually,
the PRO Act that you were referring to
yes,
earlier.
the PRO Act, yes. And that bill has actually been stonewalled in the Senate because of 3 Democratic holdouts, to the 2 Arizona senators, and then actually one of my senators, Mark Warner, who has a business experience, business background, and who's very concerned about reclassifying independent contractors as employees, interestingly enough. So I appreciated his sentiments there. But we don't anticipate Congress even passing it because it's so gridlocked, which is encouraging to me from an independent standpoint. But observers will be like, well, if you change the filibuster rule, then you can see something like this happen. But as it stands right now, pending no changes to the filibuster, God willing, you won't see this rammed through in Congress. So I think people have to focus their efforts on David Weil coming back potentially to the Department
Mhm.
of Labor and what he will do. I think I talked to you before we went to the air that there was a memorandum of understanding signed between the Department of Labor and the National Labor Relations Board to crack down on so-called misclassification cases as it relates to joint employer rules, as it relates to independent contractors or employee-employer relationships. So they will look to the regulatory means to change employment law, to change how workers are classified, potentially, if Congress does not take that
Yeah.
effort into their own
Yeah.
hands. So you have to, from a legal standpoint, there's going to be a lot of litigation, perhaps to counter the efforts, counter any rules changes that they enact. So this is something I think lawyers will be really, really impressed upon to look into, maybe take a second look at, and really start to talk to their friends who are freelancers, and ask for their concerns, and maybe lend some legal help if necessary.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot here to definitely talk about with regard to laws. So just so that people that are watching understand, when we're talking about the ABC test, we're talking about a change in the standard of the law that's applied as the as courts analyze the situation as to whether someone is properly classified as an employee versus an independent contractor. Now, when I was studying for the California bar, the standard was I don't remember precisely because I've been so focused on everything that happened with the Dynamics case in AB 5. So it's like my memory's been a little bit wiped, but so it's like I kind of have to review the earlier days, the olden times, right? But it had a lot to do with how much the employer had control over
Mm-hmm.
over the worker. Do they require them to wear a uniform? Do they
Mm-hmm.
require them to, do they have, certain requirements for not just the outcome of the product, or the product or the service that they're providing, but the way in which they're performing that service, or that they're going about making that product. How much control are they asserting? That really was basically at the heart of that analysis. Kind of makes sense to me. Like, I remember when I was studying for the bar exam, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is easy peasy, makes sense. What happened in 2018 was the Supreme Court of California had a case that came, up to, like I said, up to the California Supreme Court. It was called Dynamics, and they said no, this standard is no longer any good. For whatever reason, they just decided it was outdated, and they said we're going to come out with this new 3-factor test. You've got to meet these 3 elements, and then it eventually became known as the ABC test, because ABC. So then, as is the case with any Supreme Court case, really, or even any kind of an appellate case, there's a possibility that it could be chipped away over time, it could be overruled over time, or Congress can come in, or the local legislature can come in and codify it. And that's what California's legislature did was with AB 5, was they said, hey, this is a really great standard. We really like this. And so we want to make sure that this stays around for a while. So we are going to codify this in the form of AB 5. So I will share my screen again so we can take a look at
Yes.
what that ABC test is. So this is the Labor and Workforce Development Agency website. So this is straight from the California government website here. And so I'm going to be reading through relevant parts here also to for people that are going to be listening in the podcast version, because we're starting to upload these live streams to
Yay.
Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and I'll be getting other platforms up as well. So I'm very excited about that. So I have to kind of retrain myself for people that are not able to see but just listen. Um,
Yes.
so here's what they say is the ABC test. They say under the ABC test, a worker is considered an employee and not an independent contractor unless the hiring entity satisfies all 3 of the following conditions. So what that means is the default is this person is an employee, and the employer has to prove that this person is not an employee but an independent contractor. So we talk a lot in a lot of these lawsuits, whether they're criminal cases or civil cases, that the burden of proof is typically on the plaintiff. But let's say there's a particular plaintiff that files a wage and hour claim, right? Against an employer. Wage and hour claim meaning, they didn't get they say that they didn't get certain rest breaks, certain meal breaks that they were entitled to, things like that. Then the employer can come back and say, well, you're not an employee, so you're not entitled to those things anyway. You're an independent contractor. As soon as the employee, or the plaintiff, the worker, says, well, no, actually I'm an employee, and here you go, that burden shifts to the employer to say, well, you've actually got to prove this thing now. So the 3 following conditions are: number 1, the worker is free from the control and direction of the hiring entity in connection with the performance of the work, both under the contract for the performance of the work and in fact. Now, that's very similar to the old standard, right? That's like what I mentioned before. It had a lot to do with how much control the employer had over not just the outcome of the work by the worker, but also the manner in which they did it. So that's the first element. The second element that they have to show is that the worker performs work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. So this part is one of the hardest parts, I think, for an employer to show, because if you are someone that this is just kind of part of your business model, is to sort of hire out a lot of these other minor tasks, and they're minor, and they're not necessarily core things, but they're in the regular course of your business. That is something that is going to be very alarming to a lot of employers, or a lot of entrepreneurs in this space. Because let's say, for example, let's say for me, let's say I hire an editor. I hire somebody to make the thumbnails for my videos. Those are all tasks that are well within the scope of my business, but those are all very minor tasks that would be like that wouldn't really necessarily warrant giving someone a full employment status. you
You
know
don't give
um
those people benefits.
yeah, just to do like a 10 10, 15, 20 minutes of work to make a thumbnail, you know? So, I mean, depending on how much bulk you have, right? Because it's like at a certain point, then it makes sense to hire someone, you know, for a long-term basis, right? So, but if you're in an earlier stage of your entrepreneurship, of your startups, you know, situation, then it might not necessarily make sense. So it's one of those things that really kind of puts a stressor on especially smaller businesses here. Like that's really who's impacted by this ABC test. And then finally, the last part that they have to show is that the employer has to show that the worker is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature as that involved in the work performed. So if this is you could have an independent contractor lawyer that's working for a particular company. You know, like I do contracting work for a legal tech company. So I am someone as a lawyer that is in an independently established trade. You know, that's lawyers are very often working for themselves. It's very common, you know, but to say that, you know, you've got like a random truck driver that works for himself, or a random limo driver that works for himself, that may be something that's a little bit harder to show under this kind of an analysis, right? um and so that's the basics of the ABC test under AB5. Now, in the last election in 2020, there was a measure in California that was really pushed by, of course, not a small business, big businesses, Lyft and Uber. That was Prop
Mhm.
22, that they wanted a carve out for their particular industries, for basically these rideshare companies, because they took a look at this ABC test and said, "Oh, this actually kind of defines exactly all of our Uber drivers, all of our Lyft drivers. Our entire business model would be destroyed by this test. So, like, we really need to fight against this." And so there were a lot of people that were, especially unions, that were, I think, that were fighting against the passing of Prop 22, and they it ended up passing. So
Yeah.
there's this carve out. And that's really the irony of this law in California, is that, like I said, the ABC test primarily impacts these smaller businesses, and the one carve out that happened did not end up helping out any small businesses. It ended up helping, I don't know if you could call them big tech, but fairly big tech. I mean, Uber and Lyft I mean, Uber at the very least is international. Lyft, I'm not sure, but is definitely national. These are not small startups anymore.
Yeah, they've certainly grown to be big conglomerates, and a lot of big labor proponents use them as scapegoats to say, well, let's look at the case of these companies. We keep hearing inklings of drivers saying they're exploited, they don't have benefits. So they go in and say, well, these people need rescuing from unions, these drivers who largely don't want to be unionized. And then they say, well, let's give them benefits because they need it. And actually Uber, I think if private companies decide to give workers benefits, and maybe there's like portable benefits and there's some sort of middle ground you can approach without calling these workers employees, that's still being debated, whether or not you can encourage portable benefits. Although I think the freelancers have to look for portable benefits themselves. So you're in control of your healthcare, your dental, and then not have companies kind of be at the behest of your healthcare decisions. That's another sub conversation. And I'm hoping to learn more about that myself, because healthcare is a whole nother mess as it relates to workers. But a lot of people want to put more constraints on healthcare, not give people choices. And so there will probably be a wider conversation about the benefit discussion, although that's a really minor piece of why people choose to go into freelancing. You don't hear, even anecdotally, a gig worker who was an Uber or Lyft driver and say, you know what? I'm driving because I'm just really gung ho about the benefits. Like, I really need benefits right now. And this is not to say that benefits aren't important, but they're very secondary or even tertiary when it comes to what motivates workers to work or pick up different contract gigs. You're going to hear a lot of Uber and Lyft drivers, for instance, say, I really love the flexibility. I love being able to work for both Uber and Lyft, or maybe one or the two, maybe DoorDash, perhaps working for another company on the side. I've met a lot of immigrants too, who are fresh to the United States, who said, because of certain limitations to employment as a green card holder, as a person with a work visa, I can't get a full-time job. So I think they found refuge in Uber and Lyft because it's not so strenuous in terms of the barriers to entry for certain workers. So they look to that as an option when they're just fresh out of their home country, settling here in the United States. These are people who come here legally, of course, with documentation. And they find these outlets here and say, this is a good starting point. It's not my end all be all for my career choice. I actually met someone who's a doctor who said that it's really hard for him to immediately explore his profession here. He was a doctor back in, I think, Pakistan. And then he said that he's doing Uber and Lyft because he wants to make money in preparation for going back into the medical field. And you hear this echoed across different, let's say, Uber and Lyft drivers who tell you they love it. They may not like be so loving about it, perhaps, but it's convenient and it pays the bills. But you won't hear abject hatred of it from most workers unless someone is disgruntled. Maybe they found someone to say, let's go after Uber and Lyft, maybe a frivolous lawsuit. You never know. Like they can find, there are a lot of ambulance chasers out there, as you know, in the legal profession. So they could find some disgruntled former driver who wanted to sue Uber or Lyft on some grounds that they were misclassifying them or exploiting them. Although you willingly go into a contract that you sign with the company as a driver, you agree to their terms and conditions, you're using your car to pick up, drop off passengers. So you're really in control of what you do, although you are handed different tasks and responsibilities, but you have the freedom to pick up the route, pick the route you want to choose, the passengers you want to take, you give ratings to passengers, and then you just use that model for yourself and apply that in your driving responsibilities. And you can apply that to other type of gig work like this from bigger businesses like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, things of that sort. And so maybe save for a small sampling. Most drivers that I've encountered anecdotally, I've driven Uber, Lyft a couple dozen times, never really hear anything super bad. Like I said, I think a lot of people, especially if they're immigrants and they're new to the country, they think it's a refuge for them to get their starting point in their career here in the United States, because it is really hard to find a job. I know from my family's experience, when you're here just learning English, maybe, or you have no idea how the United States work, finding employment is extremely hard if you want to contribute to the fabric of this country, because most people think, well, they're not going to come here and work. But a lot of people actually do come here and they really want to work because they didn't have those opportunities in their home country. So as a way to kind of like help people climb the economic ladder, this is a really good introductory tool. Is it perfect? No. Could there be improvements made? Absolutely. But to completely upend the system by classifying the workers as employees, pretty controversial. And that's what California demonstrated, especially with the populace there. Like California is very, very far to the left. And a plurality of the vote in 2020 voted 56, 57% to allow Prop 22 to go into effect, to vote it in under the ballot initiative, and for the California government to adopt it into law as a carve out for AB 5. So it's really interesting to see that play out, especially the fact that big labor has a big hold in California. They're very influential in Sacramento.
Right.
And so the people spoke. So maybe the sort of advocacy in Sacramento is really disconnected from the overwhelming majority of California voters. And that's really interesting. Like I said, it's like a schism between the far left and maybe the moderate left in California. And so it's really interesting to just observe that and see what will happen if this were to take hold federally. But in California, even where big labor reigns supreme, the voters said, this is too extreme. We can't afford this. And even if we have our grievances with Uber and Lyft, this is a big, big step too far and away from the intention of trying to make worker freedom palatable to the masses.
Yeah. And I have another anecdote. I'm not an immigrant, but I was also a driver for Uber and Lyft for a while. I don't know if the viewers will be surprised by that or not, but after I graduated from law school and took the bar exam, and I was kind of in between studying and then finding a job for myself, to sort of make sure that I was paying my bills and making ends meet. That's what I was doing, was driving around Southern California with my car and giving rides to people. And honestly, like, some of those rides were hilarious because some of my favorite times to drive were it was very specific. It was like Friday night at like 10 p.m. because especially in like the beach cities in Orange County, because I would be picking people up from dinner and they would be, or either picking them up from dinner as a group and then going, dropping them off at some other bar or something. And so they were all like jazzed and happy and maybe a little tipsy, after dinner. And then like, or sometimes people had been like pre-partying and then they were going to be going out to the bar or something. And people were just like in that perfect zone of like excitement and happiness and like, yeah, like we're all just having fun tonight. And like before they got to the point where they were like sloppy. Cause
Oh
like
no.
like picking them up after like a midnight or 1 a.m. 2 a.m. was particularly bad. Luckily, I never had anybody get sick in my car. There was someone that was like, I was almost maybe seemed like she was going to, but it was fine. But you know, I I knew that you're not gonna get rich off of driving Uber and Lyft, right? So I didn't obviously view that as anything long term, but it was I was so grateful for having that as a quick opportunity to just jump into something really quick. I can turn it on and off whenever I want to. If I know I need to make a little bit of money over a weekend, I can drive for however many hours. My very first ride actually was I picked up my very first person, and I get there and they were like, "Hey, so I know we're in South Orange County. Uh, you could totally reject this ride, but we need to get to Palm Springs." And that's like a 2 hour
It
drive
is.
right there.
It's a
So that
hike.
was like the funniest thing, that was like my very first like rider that I picked up. Or there was a couple actually. And they were like moving out there. It was kind of an odd situation with like their whole story. But it was my very first one. And I was like, I guess this is normal. Like, I'm gonna make sure that I'm like keeping in contact with my family to make sure that I don't get spirited away somehow on this trip. But like you said, I personally, this is just my experience. I was very grateful for that opportunity to jump into something to make sure that I'm paying my bills. And it was never intended by me, and every driver that I've ever talked to, I've never seen them, look at it as some kind of a long-term plan or a
Mhm.
long-term career. They're either people that are in the situation that I was in, just sort of filling a particular gap until they did what they were really going to be doing. Or like that doctor from Pakistan that you talked about,
Mhm.
or like him and others that were immigrants that are kind
Transitory,
of,
yeah.
yeah, just sort of like, this is a landing spot, and then I'm going to figure out my next step. Or I've met people that were like recently retired, and they're like,
Mhm.
I've got a pension. I have nothing else to do, so I'm just going to have fun
Yeah.
and talk to people while I drive them in my car. So yeah, so I totally do agree with you, and I think it's just it's also kind of a metaphor for a lot of these other positions that people take in these gig economy
Mhm.
kind of positions, whether they are you know uh driving people around or doing DoorDash, or you know um um you know uh having like I said, like helping somebody with an Etsy shop, doing something digital with helping people with editing or
Mhm.
making logos, or like people do these things, um not necessarily intending for it to be long term, but maybe being long term.
Mhm.
Like you yourself, you're a freelance writer. That's for all intents and purposes, at least appears to be what your plan is. So it's you know I do think that there is a lot to be said for the fact that people are making these choices consciously, and they're
Mhm.
making them with their free will. And
Absolutely.
so it seems to me that the vast majority of these cases are people uh, that are actually making these in healthy situations. Now,
Mhm.
there are also, of course, the cases where people are being taken advantage of, right? That are being uh, you know as I think we can both agree that there are situations where people are being misclassified as independent contractors, just to sort of skirt the laws, on employment, or sometimes immigration, or
Mhm.
but uh, but that, I think, for me, I think that having the older standard of legal analysis for an independent contractor doesn't prevent anyone from being able to enforce those laws
Mhm.
nonetheless, even without the ABC test.
Yeah, absolutely. And my examination into it, even as a non-lawyer, is a lot of the standards that we have in place, they work, they're just not properly enforced. So if someone is really engaging in an egregious abuse of worker misclassification, the laws that are already in the books can be enforced and you punish those employers. Simple as that. But to create new standards where everyone will be presumed to be an exploiter of workers. Every employer is going to be assumed, unless they present evidence that they're not, if they have to be subjected to an ABC test, for instance. That creates so much confusion. And in California, let's say for this instance of why they targeted first Lyft and Uber, they thought the law would just, they billed it as the law just going after these horrible companies. But what we saw with the law going into effect, it actually affected full-time freelancers, florists, translators, journalists. A lot of journalists in California and freelance writers who were writing high dollar type articles and content, they were capped at 35 articles per publication. And some people hit that threshold in a month. So they would essentially make a year's worth of their salary in a month under the new law. So a lot of journalists were very upset, rightfully so. And you see like bakers, and even like you said, IC lawyers. You could see lots of people, highly skilled white collar professionals are now starting to enter the freelance economy because they just don't like what's happening in their workplace. I think the workplace has become too politicized. A lot of people also realize the limitations of their industries. For me, I realized I couldn't move up in the political industrial complex, as I call it, not because I couldn't compete. I applied to many different places. It just felt like opportunities were scarce unless you had a connection through your parents. You somehow had to maybe not be as outspoken or something. So there were certain biases against you if you weren't somehow connected, or if you weren't like a preference point. And this is just my sinister thinking of certain things. Um, but it was really hard to make your mid-level career step for me. And I've heard this from many others who've talked to me privately and said, to work in politics, to find your mid-level career, unless you're creating a business or consultant shop, and I do consulting too, because that's how I make most of my money. I would be poor if I just simply relied on writing on a freelance basis, but that is a big chunk of what I do. I noticed that, yeah, when you're limited in your industry or your field, and that's what a lot of people are feeling now. I was just kind of on the, I would say, not cutting edge, because there are many people who've been freelancing a lot longer than me. In terms of millennials freelancing, I would say I'm one of the early cases of millennials going into this full-fledged. And I'm not alone. There are millions of other millennials and even Gen Zers. This is actually a very popular option among younger generations, our generation and those behind us. And we see that the traditional 9 to 5 job is not really amenable to our interests. We want to have freedom to choose who we work with. We want greater flexible options so we can take time off and not only just have 2 weeks of vacation. I can have more vacation time if I want, because I determine the schedule, I determine everything that I do. Certainly, like, different clients that I have are like, can you at least fulfill basic responsibilities with us? And I'm like, yeah, I will. And then obviously I'm in control of those duties, even though we work together mutually in our contract for me to fulfill certain things. But I'm in control of what I do, and I fulfill tasks asked of me if it's required of me to do so. And yeah, a lot of people will feel the limitations of their careers. They don't like that perhaps they have to deal with a mandate from their employer. We see this just recently. Yesterday, the Supreme Court ruled that big businesses with those who have over 100 employees cannot mandate vaccines on their workers, which is encouraging to me that the Supreme Court ruled in that way. It's encouraging.
Yeah.
I like the result of that, personally speaking, because I thought it was just too wide reaching. A lot of violations for workers, impeding on their freedom. And as we're seeing, unrelated to this, that the mandates don't really work. We see a lot of influx of cases, higher rates of cases now in cities that institute vaccine passports, in cities and areas that impose more mandates. So it's not really working as a policy. And I think the Supreme Court recognized that and said big employers shouldn't do this. If they want to privately encourage people, that's a whole different story. But from the government mandating businesses to do this, obviously it was found to be illegal, and they can't proceed with that. So I think people just see just their workplaces evolving into unrecognizable scenes and environments. They don't like perhaps strenuous conditions applied to them. And maybe they realize like they want a better work-life balance. I think people fail to understand that when you work flexibly, you may work a little bit more than 40 hours a week. Not a problem. People work more than 40 hours in 9-to-5 jobs, like lawyers or people on Wall Street. I've heard people on Wall Street work 80 hours a week sometimes.
Yeah.
So could that not be?
Same in law.
Yeah.
Same in law.
Yeah. So it's just a different framework. I also think it's a way for them to extract more revenue from the tax code. So right now, if you're an independent contractor like me, you're paying state, federal income taxes, and then you also pay a self-employment tax. I can't imagine what it would be if the PRO Act were to be enacted. They would probably find more ways to, they'd obviously maybe replace the self-employment tax with some other tax. I would be paying union dues because that's ideally what they want to do. It's not just simply moving you back to a 9-to-5 job. They want you to be a traditional employee who is forcibly unionized. The PRO Act has different caveats and conditions to it in addition to the ABC test. They want to abolish right to work, which gives people the flexibility to choose whether they want to join a union or not in their workplace. And that should be the option available to workers. If they want to join a union, go for it. If you don't want to join a union, you shouldn't be coerced into it. That's existing law. That's great. And we have to keep that in effect. Yeah. And then it also has the thing, let's say those two prongs are achieved, unions are going to have greater oversight over workplaces. And that's why a lot of businesses, small and big, corporations or not, are very concerned because they think they're more attuned to the needs of their workers, and largely the case they are, instead of unions coming in to dictate the affairs, to extract private information from workers. So if the PRO Act stipulates that if it were to go into effect, employers will be at the behest of union bosses to provide all worker information. The worker is not going to know what information, private information, is going to be dispersed to these union representatives. So it's a huge privacy violation with what they want to put into place too. And there's so many different other components to the law as well. But those three especially stick out as very troubling, very problematic. And so, like I had talked about earlier, people largely choose to not want to unionize because they see that their workers are not happy under those arrangements. There are lots of, obviously, stories about, is Amazon going to ever unionize? Although in the Alabama plant, workers have overwhelmingly rejected attempts to be unionized. In a chicken poultry plant in Delaware, the workers there just voted to get out of the union, which is really interesting. You don't hear those stories being covered much. You do hear often, I think Starbucks had their first unionized shop in Washington State, and they're picketing, things that sort. So certainly there's an appetite for some workers to want to unionize, and they say this is a resurgence of unions because they feel betrayed by corporations or different conglomerates. And that can be debatable. Of course, there are different problems with corporations. I would say it's more so their ideology with what is making them less attractive and kind of straying away from their intentional or their original mission statement, like focus on your business, not on politics, and delivering products. But yeah, there's just so much to extrapolate from this. And like I said, with the trends existing and coming out from reputable sources, Pew Research poll said that most gig workers identify as independent contractors, 68%, 67% versus 28% who say they're traditional employees. You just talk to more people. You also see even reports from the Labor Department. Over 500,000 people moved to the freelance economy, especially becoming self-employed since the start of the pandemic. And we now have, I think the number of freelancers stayed constant. It was maybe 59 million, according to Upwork, which is a great authority on tracking gig worker participation, freelance worker participation. But they have talked about more so of more workers looking into this. The Great Resignation, which is a very oft discussed phenomenon of just this mass resignation by workers in different offices, big and small. And people say, well, they're checking out from the workforce entirely. That is partly true. But according to some different surveys out, like I said, from the gig platform called Upwork. Upwork noted that about 10 million, of those workers who are resigning are potentially exploring options to work in the freelance economy. So that's a silver lining, something to be super embraced, or rather readily embraced, and we should welcome that. So even if people are withdrawing themselves from the workforce, I think people forget that they may be looking for other options and maybe finding refuge in the freelance economy.
Yeah,
And so,
and that's I think what was it? It was maybe 60 Minutes or something. That was they had a recent report on this, that
oh, did they?
they were focusing on, I think, South Carolina, the no, where was it? I think it was South Carolina, but basically one particular town, and saying that that they were interviewing a bunch of employers that were particularly like restaurant employers, were noticing that they were seeing a lot of people in retail, people in restaurants. That's where this great resignation seems to
Mhm.
be happening, and these people are looking for jobs that are not only outside of that general industry, but also, as you know, as we've been talking about, that are sort of gig kind of jobs that are virtual, doing like virtual assistant jobs. They also interviewed a woman that has had her own company for a long time, sort of setting up people to be virtual assistants for
Mhm.
these various companies, and a lot of those people would be impacted by this sort of like nationalization of the ABC test as well.
Yeah, and something we also want to talk about in terms of David Weil's positions, something that I think it's worth mentioning, it's not just gig workers or people who work on an individual basis. I think, and it's been expressed before by David Weil that he wants to change the dynamics of how franchises operate.
Mm,
And let's pull up, maybe you could pull back
sure.
my article
Okay.
about the joint employer rule. So franchising is part of the freelance economy. I think people don't recognize that. And I've had to learn and familiarize myself a little bit with how they would be affected by these misclassification or reclassification laws, and how the people work with these conglomerates. So let's say like a McDonald's or a Five Guys, or what is it, Sonic, or something of that nature. And so these companies have franchisors who they work with, but these franchisors act kind of independently. Yes, you're communicating and obviously pushing the products or the services of these big businesses, but you kind of operate a little differently or independently of, let's say, the big bosses, the corporation, but you're still carrying out their mission statement. And so David Weil wants to kind of look back to what he implemented, his administrative interpretation from 2015, to make it harder for franchises to operate. And I'm going to pull back from my article quickly to read this so I'm not
Yeah.
putting any
Yeah.
misinformation.
Well, how about I'll read your fantastic words here from
Oh
your
yeah,
national
you go
review
for it.
article.
Go for it.
So for anyone listening, so you wrote, aside from tanking the gig economy, Weil would also seek to undermine franchise businesses further by expanding the definition of a joint employer under the FLSA to include operations who have indirect control over their employees. He is expected to rely on his 2016 AI on joint employers for guidance, making franchise companies liable for the actions of individual franchisee employees. The effects of his 2016 rule change had devastating effects on franchises. Between 2016 and 2018, these businesses paid $33.3 billion a year in costs, lost 376,000 jobs, and witnessed a 93% increase in joint employer lawsuits filed against them. That's huge.
Yeah, that
That
is
is
not getting
massive.
discussed.
But
Mhm.
wait, there's more. This is actually what you wrote. That's not for me. In 2016, Weil promulgated an expansion of DOL's white collar overtime rule that extended mandatory pay to 4.2 million workers. The regulation doubled the salary threshold for exempt status from $23,660 to $47,446 annually. In August 2017, a U.S. District Court in Texas struck down the rule after determining that the Labor Department had overstepped its rulemaking authority. If this overtime rule were to be adopted today, the Small Business and Entrepreneurial Council has warned such a revision could harm small businesses as our economy works to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Yikes. Yeah.
Yeah, people don't think of franchises as small businesses, but they are, even though they are at the behest of these bigger companies. And yeah, so we have to bandwidth a franchise company. So he would attack millions of workers in this country, whether they work independently of companies or they work in sync with companies, but operate independently as franchises. And so could you imagine how that would upend the economy if all these rules changes were to go into effect? Like that
Mhm.
scares me personally speaking.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah.
why the business community has been so opposed to David Weil. And actually yesterday, the Senate Help Committee, which oversees these type of nominations for labor and related departments, they just went through with voting to proceed with his nomination. And we will soon learn whether or not the full Senate will vote to confirm him. He was previously under oath to kind of talk about his credentials, and he actually didn't make it out of committee last time in August. I think he was stuck with an 11-11 committee vote. So his nomination was stalled, and then they renominated him, and now it seems like he will go up for a full Senate vote. I don't know what the timeline is for that yet. But that's why you see a lot in the business community, from big businesses to small businesses to one-person businesses like myself, really alarmed at his writings, some of his expressed goals, uh, his potential to change rules, obviously different indicators to really just weaken businesses in this country, especially those still reeling from the onslaught of the pandemic. And they just don't learn from past mistakes. In my view, they're not listening to the business owners, they're not listening to the entrepreneurs, and they're wanting to impose these really onerous regulations to make it harder to own and operate a business, whether you're working for yourself or you're working for someone else and you have multiple gigs. So to me, it seems like this should be an area where everyone can come together. If you support small business, this is the issue to really take on and to kind of get on board with. I don't know if anyone watching is going to be empowered to get involved politically, but there are ways where you could truly make your voice heard on this issue. One group that I do recommend is called the Fight for Freelancers, which is a broad-based kind of grassroots coalition that I'm indirectly a part of. I'm in their Facebook group. It's a great way just to exchange ideas and learn. Oh gosh, they're wonderful organizations. Like I said, Independent Women's Forum is really on the cutting edge supporting freelancers. There's Americans for Tax Reform. There's also the the Institute for the American Worker is a phenomenal free market labor rights organization. I've been talking to them on and off for many months, and they're doing great work. And I think you're going to hear more from them. And there's just many ways to get involved, and I can happily share some tips and suggestions for how to get involved and for how to fight for freelancers.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. And send me links to all of those different groups after we're done, because I'll add them to the description in the below the video so that people can readily check those out. And then I'll do the same when I upload this audio to the podcast. But that's awesome. I'm glad that there's some potential marching orders if people are feeling particularly incensed about this subject.
Mm-hmm.
So other than that, it sounds like this is a lot of, this is like some of the main stuff that is possibly potentially concerning about David Weil, serving again in this sort of capacity, especially coming right out of this pandemic, which we're still very much in. But the economy it's trying to recover while we're still in it. And the jobs numbers, didn't that just come out recently for this
very
last
dismal
quarter?
Yeah.
So it's one of these situations where we really
Plugging
need
my
to
computer in.
Oh yeah.
One moment.
Yeah, sure. So, but I'll keep talking for the viewers though. But this is just kind of one of those situations where, our economy, we're really trying to. I'm just telling the viewers while we're waiting. It's one of those situations where this is. Oh yeah, where the economy is trying to recover. We're trying to get people out there back into jobs, into whatever jobs that they are, finding most particularly fulfilling, or what they want to do, with it can all considerations for the great resignation that's going on at the same time. And so these kinds of regulations are potentially concerning because it could possibly hobble our ways of getting back to where we were
Mhm.
before what March 2020, when everything kind of crashed.
Absolutely. And I think, like I said, the market is trending, or the job market, I would say, is trending in this direction where you're not constrained by your workplace. You don't necessarily have to go into an office anymore. People really like the remote option, or virtual option, so to speak. Also, people kind of like a hybrid setting. Maybe they'll want to spend some time at home and maybe go to the office. And for the longest time, for some reason, businesses rejected kind of flexible options, yet the pandemic obviously thrown onto all of us. A lot of people realize that maybe we don't have to be stuck in these constraints, and that we could still run efficiently, and my workers and employees can be happy, or individual workers can be happy and fulfilled, and be in control of their careers more so, or their business operations more so. And for me personally speaking, I just love being able to select and choose who to work with. Like, and I have the luxury and fortune of being able to travel for my line of freelancing, because I
Mhm.
have to go outdoors to kind of see different things happening. I've visited fracking sites. I've seen bear conservation in the flesh. I've seen different things, and my job requires me to travel, and I love it. So it's not just tedious work where I'm just stuck at home working from my computer. I'm actually having to see things in the field, which I really love. And I think in other industries too, where freelancers work, they can also determine and fine tune different activities where they can enjoy the work they do. So your work is not stuffy and boring, and you're fun, and you're feeling fulfilled, and you're happy, and you get to explore the country. You get to work with phenomenal people. And so you don't really get that sometimes in a traditional workplace sometimes. Yes, you do get to travel. I used to travel a lot for my old work job, or for my old job, excuse me. But like for this, I get to choose like my travel schedule. I get to choose where I get to go. I'm not just told by dictate, like you have to go here. I get to pick and choose my accommodations. I get to pick and choose different things and activities to do on the side once my work responsibilities are fulfilled. I try to enjoy my travel when I go for work, because work travel should be fun and enjoyable. I fully believe that. And
Definitely.
yeah, and let's say like you want to get married and start a family, it's really easy to withdraw yourself from the workforce when you're participating in the gig economy or freelance economy, because you could say, I'm going to pause my business to raise my child. I'm going to go on maternity leave for a few months, or I'm going to go on maternity leave for 6 months or a year. And then you can come back to your business. You can alert your clients that you're returning and say, hey, I'm back open for business. Let's resume where we left off, especially if you
Mhm.
have great relationships with the clients you work with. And you don't really get that much sometimes in a traditional work setting. I know a lot of people have said, like, well, there has to be improved family paid leave. There has to be this, or I work too much. I don't feel like I can focus on my family. So with these flexible options coming into play, I think you're going to see more conversations about accommodations for better policies to make it easier for people to choose what's best for them, to give them more time off. And like I said, people don't want constraints. They want freedom to choose who they work with, where to work, how to work. They love the flexibility that comes with this. This is universally accepted among all Americans, regardless of age, race, sex, geographical location, uh, education status, and even work level experience. So this is one unifying, I would say, sector of the economy. And I think it's even part of the greater decentralization movement. And people really shrug at that term. They shrug at it because of, let's say, like digital currency, like non-fungible tokens. And while I don't dabble into Bitcoin, I'm very sympathetic to it being able to exist, because it is a decentralized form of currency and of
Mhm.
the economy too, kind of like gig work is. And so I
Mhm.
can at least symbolically support it, because government is trying to regulate it and put constraints on it, and not allow it to flourish. And same what they're doing with the freelance economy. So decentralization should be welcomed and embraced in many tenets and facets of life. I'm a firm believer in that. I know some watching may not share that, but I think when you offer people these decentralized options, whether it's a format or a decentralized form of currency, it gives people greater latitude to do what they want to do and to not harm anyone and to live freely. I think in the United States, we should be able to still have those options and really inspire the rest of the world to adopt similar measures too, and to allow for worker freedom. And yeah, like I said, let's not make decentralization a dirty term. I think that's been a longstanding tradition in the United States. It should be a tradition here. Like our families experienced in the Soviet Union. I know my family did. Everything was so centralized. And for me to not embrace that, I think, is making my relatives who had suffered very, very proud. And I think they would be very encouraged by seeing what I'm doing now, even though they're not here on earth anymore. They're deceased, unfortunately. And so kind of honoring my family as a first generation American, I think this is a way to showcase to people that we have these options available to us. Many parts of the world don't, or they're very highly regulated. And if we can't allow this last bastion of freedom through the freelance economy to really explore your entrepreneurial chops to flourish, and you see more constraints placed on it, more regulations, more red tape to make it harder for you to work flexibly, or to be labeled as a traditional employee when you're not, we could descend into some very, very dark paths. And we don't want to see that here in the United States. But like I said, if you want to join a union and be an employee, go ahead. But also give us the latitude in the freelance economy to identify and work the way that we want to work. So that's kind of what I wanted to conclude on.
Nice. I love it. And let me I do have a super chat that I neglected to get to at the beginning, but the Kenosha County Eye has said Legalbytes for president. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you came in and supported. So I appreciate it. I'm not running, no time soon, probably never, but, I don't know that anyone would actually want to see how that would turn out, but, but I do appreciate the sentiment. But that's fantastic. I think those are some really great points. And I think, so I guess we'll leave with this. How can people get in touch with you?
Well, since most people are probably watching on YouTube or some sort of streaming service, I do have a YouTube presence, and I do appreciate you tagging me. That's very kind of you to do that. That's a first channel or portal you can connect with me. I also have all my social media accounts linked there. It's actually really easy to find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter because I am denoted by a blue check mark. And I'm grateful to the social media companies for recognizing that, because I've had people try to.
You're one of those blue check marks. You're part of the blue check mark mafia.
But I'm not elitist. And I'm one of the few blue checks who is not, I would say, very kind of like, put your nose up and look down on people who are not verified. I'm definitely not like that. I'm a lot of fun on social media too. I try to invite people for conversation. I don't try to talk about politics everywhere I go. Twitter is my mostly political format. Instagram, I like to showcase like my fishing and travel pictures or outdoor adventures. I also have a website called GabriellaHoffman.com where you can see my past case studies for client work. I post blog posts there. I also run a podcast for those of you who care about the energy, environment, and natural resources beat. I focus largely on public policy there, and I break down different laws, good and bad, or bills, good and bad. I have original interviews with different newsmakers, whether they're lawmakers or someone who is a upstart activist or a nonprofit manager, things of that sort. I invite really interesting folks to come on and chat with me about the great outdoors and how best to keep and preserve them. You can find my work at independentwomensforum.org or iwf.org. I explore more about the gig economy there. The Young Voices program, you type in my name, you'll find some of my work there as well. I write a regular town hall column on Fridays and sometimes on Mondays in their VIP column section. Today, I actually explored some good legislation in the Virginia General Assembly, including a bill to protect independent contractors. And maybe another topic we could talk about later, we still have these government-run alcohol liquor stores, which boggle my mind. The only good thing California had in place policy-wise was no ABC stores. So we have a bill to abolish the ABC stores here in Virginia. Hopefully that goes through. And I talk about some interesting legislation.
I've never heard of that before.
It's an East Coast thing.
An actual government-run liquor stores.
DC does not have this, but Virginia does.
We've come a long way from the prohibition.
I know, like 90 years later. And so I like to focus on interesting stories. Like I may even, like I said, dabble into like abolishing ABC stores a bit more, because I'm not a drunk or anything of that nature. I believe everything in moderation, but you won't be able to change people's drinking behaviors if you put government in charge of this. And I listed in my column actually how there was a lot of excessive force used by the agency for cases that should not have resorted to excessive force. So that's a common conversation here in Virginia. Like, the agency needs to be reined in or privatized because of misgivings from the past. There were cases where they hassled a girl for buying non-alcoholic LaCroix beverages. They beat up another UVA student because he presented a supposed fake ID to get into a bar. So there will be a conversation about that. So that's something I look into as well.
Okay.
But yeah, I focus a lot about Virginia. If anyone lives in Virginia and is interested about kind of the future of our new state government, I'm actually personally very optimistic about it. I think Virginia can become a business-friendly state again. I think you're going to see a lot of improvements to worker freedom and many, many other interest areas, because we were lagging behind actually a lot of our neighbors in the Carolinas, West Virginia, and some other nearby states. So I think Virginia is going to be on everyone's radar very soon. And if you want to start a business here, it's going to be easier. It's going to be a more business-friendly climate. We're not going to have as many COVID restrictions in place, which is wonderful. And I think you're going to see Virginia really stand out economically. And we welcome you guys to come to visit and maybe even move here. I think a lot of people really enjoy it.
I do love Virginia. I haven't lived there myself, but obviously I've visited you there quite a bit from living in DC. And it's just, it's great. I especially, I mean, I adore Alexandria, especially Old Town Alexandria. It's just, it's wonderful. It's beautiful, but there's so much else in Virginia that's to be loved. So yeah, I totally echo your sentiments there. And one last super chat before we go out, because this is, of course, my brother, Andy the Game Maker, says,
hey,
"Good
Andy.
morning, Gabby." So I know it's been a while since you and he talked.
I know.
But he was on that same ill-fated
yes.
trip through SFO, the long 15 hours of, oh no, it's just 1 more hour delay. It's just 1 more hour delay. That was fun. But fun childhood stories. So yeah, I mean, so aside from that, so everybody, be sure to check out Gabby's work. I mean, you can find her obviously in so many different places. I've got a couple of them already linked in the description below, but I'll probably be updating that with some of this other stuff, like your website and maybe some of these other locations as well. And so be sure to check her out. Subscribe to her channel if you want to see those kind of interviews. One that went particularly viral was an interview with Governor Noem.
Yes, Kristi Noem of South Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
She's very fascinating.
Yeah, that was a really great one, and I think you weren't even monetized yet or something. That was one that I think helped you get monetized, which was very exciting. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff there, a lot of interesting stuff on Instagram and Twitter. You can go and yell at her for being part of the blue check mafia,
and you'll find me retweeting a lot of elitist takes, which I'm happy to do and support. And it's such a pleasure to chat with you. I'm so impressed by the YouTube growth you had. You told me, you're like, Gabrielle, I'm going to start a YouTube account. And it's been amazing, and a testament to the fact that you're such a hard worker and you've cracked the YouTube algorithm fantastically. So I'm so proud of you for the growth. And I'm really honored that you had me come chat with you on this format. You're going to come onto my channel at some point so people can learn about your legal work. And we'll be able to cross-pollinate hopefully a little more. If you want more topics discussed, we can weigh into environmental law. We can weigh into alcohol and anything else you have an interest in. So thank you for having me on.
That sounds awesome. Yes. Thank you so much for being on here. And thank you for being one of my earliest supporters. I mean, I remember when I told a bunch of friends and family and stuff that I was starting this channel, and you were the first person that was like, heck yeah, I'll amplify your channel to my, like, whatever 50,000 followers or whatever you have on Twitter. And I was just like, oh my God, you have so many people. Like, that's crazy. And so it's been, from very humble beginnings, and we're, we're continuing the grind. And it's a lot of the people watching probably know this already, but a lot of that growth was attributed to being part of LawTube, and particularly being part of LawTube at a time when the Kyle Rittenhouse trial was going on. So I grew. I know Nick Recada's channel was the main centerpiece there. His channel grew. Good Logic, Uncivil Law, everybody saw some really great growth because of that. And I'm so grateful for it, so thankful for it. And I'm really thankful for the community that we've been able to sort of establish and grow and whatnot. And I'm really grateful that you're part of this community too now. So it's great. I love it. So with that, I guess we'll cut that off and we'll end the stream, and we'll see you guys in the next video. After this, coming up actually relatively soon, I'm going to be going live again just to talk about the Supreme Court vaccine mandates. So there are opinions that came out yesterday on those. So with that, like I said, I'll see you in the next video. Okay.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for getting to know you.
Bye.